12 days from the Korean snap election. CSIS Capital Cable is here to cover it all. With us, Dr. Adam Her, Tufts University, Scott Snyder, KEI, all that and much more next on the Capital Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in DC or Boston, as the case may be. Good evening to those of you in Korea. Good day to those of you around the world. Welcome to the 113th installment of the CSIS Capital Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. This week on the Capital Cable, 12 days from the snap election in the Republic of Korea. Candidates in full swing, campaign underway. We are joined by two experts to unpack, dissect, analyze it all. And with us, again, perfectly positioned to do just that, we have one, the famous Dr. Adam Her from Tufts University, and of course, Mr. Scott Snyder from KEI, who's been on the program with us before. Let's get into a proper introduction and greeting for each one of our special guests here today. First, Dr. Her is from Tufts University, of course, as I just mentioned, an unbelievably distinguished background and academic, I guess I would say, compilation of impressive works. Can't really talk today, but her education includes PhD from Princeton University, MPP from Harvard University, and BA with honors, Stanford University. Yes, go Cardinal. I never did an honors thesis, so I fell far short on that. And of course, she is the Kim Koo Chair in Korean Studies and Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. Her research focuses on nationalism and democracy with special attention to issues of identity, integration, and democratic support in East Asia. She is very, very accomplished in terms of her publications, as I previously mentioned. She served as the 2021 Sherman Emerging Scholar at the Korea Society, a 2018-2019 CSIS U.S. Korea Next Gen Scholar, and is a recipient of a 2023 Gold Chalk Award for teaching from the University of Missouri. Welcome to this show, Dr. Her. We are honored to have you on for the first time, I believe.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, terrific. All right, let's move on to Mr. Snyder. Scott, welcome back to the show. Scott, of course, is President and Chief Executive Officer of KEI, the Korean Economic Institute of America. Previously, this is where I think most know Scott from, he was a senior fellow for Korea Studies and the director of the program of the U.S. Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations from 2011 to 2024. He's the author of obviously several, I guess I'd say, prominent publications. I'm stumbling over my P's this morning. Anyway, look those up online. They are terrific. I've read them. And of course, he has a BA from Rice University, Go Owls, and a MA from Regional Studies East Asia program at Harvard University. Scott, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Mark, and really good to be on the show with Dr. Ha.
All right. Doctor, let's go to you first. And first of all, I should note, No Victor book tour. We should call his book tour, or maybe the book itself, The Never-Ending Story, because it seems to go on and on. But we're very, very excited to have him back. All right, Doctor, Professor, you're up first on the Capital Cable. Again, welcome to the show. If you wouldn't mind, just broad strokes, catch us up on what's happening with this snap election in Korea. We have two main candidates. We've got some third parties. We've got 12 days before an election. We had the court obviously intervene in the previous presidency, which triggered all this. But please bring us up to speed. And again, thanks for appearing on the Capital Cable.
Of course. I mean, we have multiple candidates running in this snap election, but it really has now at this point narrowed down to a three-way race between candidate Kim Moon-soo, who is the conservative PPP's candidate, Lee Jae-myung, the progressive DP's candidate, and then Lee Jun-seok, the candidate for the Reform Party, which is a splinter party that came off of the conservative bloc. And, you know, if you look at the polls, and we can talk more about, you know, the credibility of the polls, et cetera, but in general, on average, Lee Jae-myung is in the lead by anywhere from about 10 to 15 percentage points. That's beyond the margin of error in most of these polls. But I think what's actually more important is the overall pattern of how the public support has changed over time. Since the PPP's confirmation of Kim Moon-soo, actually support for Lee Jae-myung has gone slightly up, whereas support for Kim Moon-soo has actually declined, or just kind of held steady, depending on the poll you're looking at. So that, I think that pattern is worth highlighting. Lee Jun-seok has held pretty stably, if not slightly increasing, inching towards the 10% support mark, which is, I mean, that's not enough to win the election, but that's not small enough to ignore either. And 12 days in the world of Korean politics is a very long time. I think there's still ample room for surprise, and where that might come, we can discuss later on in the show. I think the biggest thing to understand about this election is that, post-martial law crisis, the typical ideological bases for party support have become entirely destabilized on the conservative side, and greatly minimized on the progressive side. And that means that public support right now is much more elastic and context-driven than politics as usual. And so, as I said, there's still a long window for any kind of wild card event. So I think it's too early to really call.
All right, outstanding. Can I come back to you with two follow-ups? First, can you explain in a little more detail the really interesting point you made about the PPP candidate essentially being flat and or maybe perhaps dropping a bit after the slate was announced, let me put it that way, on the PPP side, and a small bounce for Lee Jae-myung on the DP side?
I think the biggest fumble so far in the campaign has actually been the PPP's bungling of its candidate selection process. I think we all have followed the overnight drama that occurred of the party trying to replace Kim Moon-soo with Han Duck-soo and then reverting back to Kim Moon-soo. And it's not even really about who eventually became the party candidate and whether we think that's the right candidate. It's what that process revealed quite publicly about the level of discord within the conservatives. And I think that, if we believe the poll numbers currently, I think that in trying too hard to win the election, the PPP may have very well sort of shot itself in the foot. The PPP right now, the conservatives, remind me a lot of the Democrats in the United States. The party is struggling with, how to define and redefine its core identity in the aftermath of the martial law crisis. And, without clear self-definition, it's extremely hard to lead, let alone compete successfully. And I think that's showing in sort of the patterns of public support.
All right, outstanding. And then just in terms of the discord, you touched on it in your previous intervention. What are the key drivers of that discord? Is it personal allegiance to the now removed from office president Yoon Suk-yeol? Is it rallying around Han Duck-soo, who was the acting president? And then obviously you mentioned there was machinations around trying to install him. Is it policy disagreements? Is it some of the above, all of the above? What is driving this discord?
I think it's a fundamental identity crisis that wasn't necessarily created by the martial law decree, but has really exacerbated through that. Kim Moon-soo has stated that the martial law decree itself was a mistake, but he has been unwilling to disavow Yoon. He received Yoon's official endorsement as the Conservative Party representative. And he surrounded himself with hardline, sort of more traditionalist conservatives. And, what that shows is sort of the strategy of doubling down on the core conservative base support. And sort of selective distancing from the action, but not the overall party base. Now, I think that in some ways, Kim Moon-soo's hands were a bit tied with Lee Jun-seok going off and branching off and forming the Reform Party and splintering from that core, and then his candidacy being threatened with the presence of Han Duck-soo. He sort of had really no choice, I think, politically in order to legitimize his candidacy to rally around the core base of the conservatives. But now that he is the official PPP candidate, I think that he needs to lean away from sort of the recent series of failures of the party. I'm talking, going back all the way to Park Geun-hye's impeachment in 2016. And really lean back into what the conservatives have historically done best, right? And that's smart, strong state command of the economy and development. And so I think, when we were chatting before the show started, we were like, there's a lot of personalistic politics here and not enough issues. And I think this is the time for the party, the conservatives, to really lean back into the performance that they do best. Right, their legacy, and put forth a really comprehensive and convincing plan there to the public.
All right, outstanding. Thanks, Professor, for getting us out of the gates so strong. Really outstanding analysis. Let's go to Scott. Scott, Mr. Schneider, sorry, over to you. Your thoughts on this bucket of issues?
Well, I think that Professor Ha gave a great initial overview of where we stand on this. And maybe what I can add is that, in some ways, I think if we're analyzing the 2025 election, we have to determine which prior elections have the greatest precedent, 2017 or 2022. And right now, I think this is looking a lot like 2017 because of the backdrop of impeachment. And honestly, for any conservative candidate, the fundamental challenge, and we have to remember that there were 8 candidates that were in the primary, so I think it was really a question of who was going to be able to manage this division between sense of loyalty to Yoon and the need to try to distance from the action that he took. And in 2017, it divided the Conservative Party. This time, there was already a splinter group with Lee Jun-seok, but essentially, it's the same sort of problem. And it's just, I think, a very difficult task to restore unity against that kind of backdrop in the course of only 60 days. And so in a way, I agree definitely that the biggest challenge that the conservatives have is the challenges of that they face internally themselves. And then I think the other issue is, how is the election actually being defined in the eyes of the voters? And I think that, that's where Kim Moon-soo is, subject to the kinds of efforts that the Democratic Party, Lee Jae-myung, is making to really associate the conservative candidacy with Yoon's actions and to try to play up the idea that the conservatives really haven't upheld democratic principles and, that they have lost legitimacy. And so, as long as that is the defining narrative, then I think that the conservatives are really going to face an uphill battle. The other question is there a way for the conservatives to redefine it about future leadership? And there I would say that the really interesting question is how Koreans feel about electing a president who will actually be unchecked by the National Assembly. In other words, all the power would be in the hands of a single party. And so I think we'll have to wait and see how that narrative plays out. Right now, it looks like the Democratic Party is actually doing better in terms of pushing its narrative. There's 12 days left. We'll have to see what happens.
All right, Scott, excellent. Let me drill down on that point and push you on a little more granularity in terms of what you've given us, some narratives. You've given us, I would say, a framework of where this election is headed, at least in terms of broad strokes. what are the key defining issues right now that the candidates are running on, with the stipulation that we've just already discussed on the show that this seems to be an issue light type of election and much more of a personality, and I guess you would also argue unity type of election, at least within the party?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the issues, both major parties have their respective platforms, and generally speaking, I think that they are what one would expect. With Lee Jae-myung, generally speaking, talking more about state solutions to economic problems, but also actually putting forward a more pro-business face than we have seen from at least the Moon Jae-in administration during the 2017 campaign. And Kim Moon-soo standing more on a deregulation platform, traditional conservative approaches, pro-business approaches. And so I think, and it really becomes a matter of, in that context, how do each of these individuals look as leaders? And so everybody knows the platforms. I'm not sure that Korean voters are motivated by the platforms as much as they might be motivated by who actually looks like they're going to be able to get the job done. And in that respect, I think that Koreans are very pragmatic. They want to know that there's somebody who has a chance of being successful. And they're not necessarily, some are influenced by the approach, but overall, I think what people are looking for is somebody who they feel is going to be able to carry the ball forward in order to make a better society.
Okay, last point here, then I'm going to come back to Dr. He. The question then is, you've got the ball moving forward, get the job done element. How does that fit with your previous comments about unchecked power by one party? What's the reaction there among the population, number one? And number two, you've got the pragmatic piece of wanting this to move the ball forward again, to use your expression. But on the other hand, you've got a very interesting principle in democratic values that Dr. He mentioned. How does that fit in the equation as well in terms of this election?
Well, honestly, it makes me think of bibimbap. It's just a big mix. And really, I think that there's an ongoing perennial debate about the role of the state and its relationship to providing for the livelihood and welfare of the people, and the role of enterprise and growth as a driver for doing the same thing. And so that's the backdrop. Then I think that people are just going to be examining, well, is this person going to be, honestly, I think in some ways it's going to be pragmatic enough to find the right mix in order to grapple with the most serious challenges. Frankly, on the economic side, both types of leadership have had to grapple with the same problems, and the next leadership is going to face the legacy of unsolved issues that revolve around many of the same issues on the domestic economic side.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks, Scott. Excellent. Let me come back to Dr. He. The question that I wanted to put to you, and obviously feel free to comment on pick up any of the threads that we've just laid out in the previous intervention. The next 12 days, you mentioned at the outset, this is an eternity in Korean politics. I would stipulate to that. What are you looking for in terms of likely actions by either camp to try to either catch up in the case of the PPP or consolidate the lead in the case of the DP, or act as a third-party spoiler, for lack of a better term, as in the case of the Reform Party? So what's likely ahead in the next 12 days?
I think the things that I'm most waiting for is to see Kim Moon-soo kind of come into his own and really, as I said, lean into the conservative strengths, the historical strengths of that party. Both sides acknowledge that alleviating economic inequality is sort of the primary domestic issue. Both sides have said that this should be done through stimulating new industries in terms of technology, AI. So actually, both parties are very much aligned on how they want to achieve this. For the conservatives, which is actually traditionally the more state-led development party in South Korea, rather than the progressives, the key thing is that they need to propose a plan that dovetails development with attention to dignity, especially for the struggling youth, where unemployment rate has hovered around 7% for the last 5 years now. And then the elderly population of 65 years and older, of whom nearly 40% actually live under the poverty line. Right. So whatever plan is proposed, deregulation, stimulating these businesses, those things, I do believe that those things are all things that will contribute to development, but that needs to be dovetailed with a comprehensive plan that offers these most vulnerable groups some kind of relief or some kind of structure going forward where they can actually be part of that expansion. And it's that point that I haven't really seen much from the PPP platform. There needs to be, just as we talk a lot about Lee Jae-myung and the DP's sort of right-clicking behavior, there needs to be more, I think, from the PPP to appeal to centrists and expand sort of the traditional notions of development that the conservatives have held. So that's actually the main thing. I think from the Lee Jae-myung side, the narrative is actually quite clear and quite strong. But from the PPP side, that's kind of what I'm waiting for to see more of. The other thing actually has not much to do, I guess, with the campaign process itself, but the election day. These opinion polls are good at providing sort of the at the moment snapshot, but they're very bad at predicting the actual election result because turnout, right? And typically turnout doesn't swing wildly, but this is not a typical election. I think the martial law crisis has really galvanized a typically very low turnout group, and that's young women in their 20s and 30s. This bloc typically has the lowest turnout rate, excluding those who are 80 years and older who are not showing up to vote for different reasons, right? And judging from their participation and the sort of shifts in the usual protester demographic post-martial law, I think they're going to be a very important force. Based on population data, the 20 to 30s bloc constitutes about 13 million of the 51 million South Korean population. And so just a 2% swing here in terms of turnout can very much yield actually about 250,000 votes, which is exactly the gap by which Lee Jae-myung lost in 2022. Now, I don't want to overstate this because obviously right now all the estimates of the gaps are much larger than that. But I think we don't have a good handle on what the turnout rate is going to look like for these typically politically disengaged groups. I think, a real silver lining from the martial law crisis is that it really transformed kind of a complacent, born democratic generation and gave them a taste, brief, but gave them a taste of what it might feel like to actually lose democracy. Forget about which party's going to win, but democracy itself. And so I think the turnout rate among the young generation is going to be a significant swing factor that we're going to find out on election day.
All right, excellent. Two follow-ups, one micro, one macro. Just the first one's more of a clarifying question. Really fascinating stuff, by the way. Do you find that the younger electorate, especially women, which you mentioned, have been motivated by this democratic ideal, for lack of a better term, or threat against it. Number one. Number two, and that's A. B is it just a situation where this has made this voting bloc more interested, it's heightened the salience of the election, and they're more likely to come out to the polls. That's micro. Macro is just in terms of this turnout question about getting it close, and you get down to 250,000 votes, or where turnout really starts to matter. Do you see scenarios by which in the closing 12 days, the PPP splinters, maybe third-party candidates sort of probably drawing some votes off of it as well, can close that gap to turn this into kind of a turnout election, for lack of a better term? Two small issues for you there, Dr. Hart.
Thank you. The first question is really about why would this group turn out, right? Are they motivated by pro-democratic principles? And I think it's actually a little bit broader than necessarily just pro-democracy. If you think about who these people are and their life experiences, this is the generation that was, they were high school students when the Sewol ferry incident occurred. If you listen to sort of the stories that came out of that incident, right, the guidelines were stay in your room, and primarily it was female students who listened to those guidelines and stayed in their rooms and died as a result of that whole mismanagement. So in high school, they have this, kind of traumatic incident in that age group. Then they grow older, become young adults, and then what happens? The Itaewon crowd crush happens. Again, in those stories, we've heard, how as the pressure began to mount, women were just physically less able to withstand that level of pressure. And if you look at the fatality rates from that, it's higher fatality rates for women. And so there are much deeper reasons too, but kind of in sort of the most immediate life cycle of this group, there have been two pretty catastrophic performance failures by the state. And it just so happened that the party that was in power during that moment were in both moments were the conservatives. And so I think that this group is motivated by a strong penchant for change, for reform. And so it's a little bit different from necessarily pro-democratic, although that might be part of it for some of these groups. But I think they're engaged in politics because they're saying, the establishment hasn't really been serving or protecting the best interests of people like me. And I think the martial law decree was kind of sort of this last straw, which now then drew them to the streets. And so I think that is their motivation. So I think, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion to which party side they're going to vote for. I think they're watching intently to see both sides and what kind of narrative solutions are coming out from both sides. So that's one. And the second question, can you remind me?
Macro question of can the conservatives close the gap to make this a turnout election at the end?
So there's been a lot of chatter about a potential unification with Kim Moon-soo and Lee Jun-seok right down the road as we get closer. If you look at the polling data and if you put those two camps together, it now actually either trumps Lee Jae-myung's lead or definitely brings it within the margin of error. So I think there's a lot of dialogue about that. Now, but the thing to understand about Lee Jun-seok and Lee Jun-seok supporters, so Lee Jun-seok, Harvard undergrad, I think appears at the outset like your, sort of elitist and part of the usual kind of conservative trope. But he actually comes from more of a lower middle class family background. And he's a self-described right-leaning liberal, by which he means that he values typically conservative ideals like meritocracy, but as a process to achieve more progressive ends like fairness, right? So if you think about who are the 10% who support Lee Jun-seok, right? Knowing that there's no chance that he is going to be a real contender in the actual outcome, but nevertheless express support for him. It's unclear to me that whole block of 10% is then going to go to the conservatives. So I think relying on a potential unification there is not necessarily a slam dunk win for the conservatives. I think, in fact, I've seen some polling data where they ask this question and it's pretty evenly split. In fact, about a good third actually say that they would actually prefer the progressive candidates. So I think we have to be careful about what that shift might look like for the conservatives. I'm a little bit skeptical that it's going to be enough to close the gap.
Gotcha. All right. Outstanding. Thanks for that assessment. Scott, over to you. Mr. Schneider, any closing thoughts on the domestic piece, the topics that we've explored? Be interested in that. And then I want to lift and shift and get into trade and foreign policy because we've got about 15 minutes left, and those are obviously central questions as well. Scott, the floor is yours.
Hey, well, I want to just say a couple of things. Professor Hogg put on the table some really interesting things to look at. And I think that they are, they could very well be where this election turns. But there are a couple of things that I'm interested in, that are not necessarily counter to that, but are, potentially also relevant. One, Korean society is getting older. There are not as many individuals in the 20s age group as there have been previously. And so how candidates reach out to older voters, I think it's already kind of baked in. The conservatives picked an older candidate. And then the other issue that I'm really interested in that Professor Hogg touched on is, 3 years ago, we saw an incredibly polarized response from voters in their 20s between men and women along party lines. And so whether or not that sustains and what that looks like will be, I think, the test for the proposition that Professor Ha has put on the table. Other issues, well, so there's a trajectory that I feel like is kind of familiar in terms of looking at public opinion polls related to elections, and that is that the race closes over the course of the end of the election, and then the data goes dark about 7 days in advance, and the really interesting question is from day 7 to day 0, does it end up continuing to close or does it widen again? And I would say that the past trajectories are mixed on that front, and it'll be really interesting to see how this comes out. I am also pessimistic about the idea that a unity candidacy is going to be the thing that closes the gap. Instead, I think that we've only had one debate so far. There's going to be 2 more debates. The campaigns are going to be, the candidates are going to make their cases, and there's also events. I think the one that you're pointing to that is really interesting as well, Mark, is the question of what do Koreans see when they think about who is going to be representing them when they meet President Trump. Because all those issues related to tariffs, related to the security relationship, they are relevant to the question of how do we envisage a Kim Moon-soo Trump meeting or an Lee Jae-myung Trump meeting. And they probably look different. And I think that both candidates have kind of laid down different cases for how they would approach that hypothetical implicitly so far. And so I'm really curious to see how that develops.
Scott, excellent. You've stolen the march on me in terms of where I was heading next. I'm not the CEO of some big fancy organization. All I've got is this show and this moderating gig, and you're killing me on it. So the guests are supposed to make the host look good. I'm joking. All right, outstanding. You've segued us perfectly into this. And let me just also add, this is not uniquely Korean in terms of this thought about who's going to represent us the country in Washington, D.C., dealing with the United States. Profound impacts in Canadian elections, profound impacts in Australian elections. So this is a global trend in a way that obviously has implications in Korea. So let me put the question to you, Scott. How is the relationship, the alliance with the United States, playing into all of this? I'm going to come to Dr. He next. And then I really want to try to get into quickly North Korea, China, a little bit of Japan. I know huge issues, about 8 minutes. So poor management by the MC here today. So Scott.
I'll try to go quick. I mean, I don't think that the alliance relationship is playing into the election that much. And I don't think that in the end, the positions of the candidates are necessarily that different on the relationship with the United States. It's actually other issues that are more important. But just to go back and reiterate, in a way that fits with Mark's overall interests, it's kind of like the thinking of the candidates who have been in the KPL, the Korean Political League, and what it looks like when they move to the WPL, the World Political League, and who is ready to make that step.
That's outstanding. It's like posting in KBO to MLB. All right, there we go. Yep. The question then, just last question on this is there a trend emerging among the electorate on who might the better candidate be? And what are the candidates doing to kind of sell or market themselves or promote themselves as that person who is best equipped to deal with the United States?
I think they've touched around the edges, but they haven't really filled in the picture. Lee Jae-myung, I think, in his interview with the Washington Post and others, has slightly shifted some of his public approaches on trilateralism and on the Korea-Japan relationship. And Kim Moon-soo has basically said, well, it's all about trust. But he hasn't really defined anything as related to what that means. So those are the two moves that I see from the major candidates that have that target in mind.
All right, outstanding. Dr. He, over to you. Same basket of questions.
We're in a rapidly shifting global order. And I think that, the public is really keen on understanding not just sort of specific things about where do you stand on U.S. alliance versus China versus Japan, North Korea, but what's the new paradigm? Like, which candidate is offering a convincing paradigm shift on where Korea should stand in this uncertainty? Is it a Korea first strategy? Is it a regional order strategy? Or is it a sort of democracy versus autocracy strategy? And which candidate is actually presenting a more cohesive and clear package on that? When you have this much uncertainty, a pragmatic approach is typically more prudent than a principled approach. And that, that just dovetails very nicely with Lee Jae-myung's foreign policy platform, where the principle actually is pragmatism, right? So, both sides are keen on keeping the US-ROK alliance strong, but the power posture that they have given is very different, right? The PPP has already been eager to try to reach a deal in terms of the tariffs, but Lee Jae-myung has sort of said, there's no rush, right? We should focus on growing our own sort of sustainable sources of economic power first. And Trump is a very personalistic diplomacy type of leader, and Lee Jae-myung has already kind of begun the groundwork, dubbing himself Korea's Trump. He went from Korea's Bernie Sanders to Korea's Trump, and imitation, I think, is not only the greatest form of flattery, but also just it's highly effective, especially for a leader like Trump. And so, I think the power posture and the ability to sort of play that diplomatic game varies across the candidates, and that's going to be a big thing. I want to actually talk a little bit about China and then the rest really quick. So, as we probably all know, Lee Jae-myung caused a bit of a stir recently with his xie remark of, we can say xie to both China and Taiwan, and the cross-strait conflict has nothing to do with us. And many experts have took this to mean, how could South Korea not care about what happens in the cross strait? I took it to mean that he meant that South Korea has little power over what happens in the cross strait and should therefore prudently hedge relations with China, given that we don't really know what the fallout is going to be from this conflict. North Korea and Japan, typically the biggest flashpoints between the left versus right. I do predict that we're going to see a more muted difference, at least in the beginning, regardless of who wins the presidency. In Lee Jae-myung's rhetoric, interests definitely trump values. And so to that, he signaled that, he's supportive of staying in the trilateral, of, re-engaging with North Korea as actually a security strategy for South Korea is how he's framed that. And so for experts who are worried about these wild foreign policy swings that typically come with partisan turnover in South Korea, this is good news. But the problem to me is that interests, unlike values, are fungible. Right? What happens when the standard for what counts as national interests changes? And, diplomatic relations, like any kind of interpersonal relationship, requires predictability. It requires consistency. And while hedging and pragmatism is all good in theory, it's at some point it becomes unsustainable to dual track economic cooperation separate from values cooperation. And so what Lee Jae-myung would do when push actually comes to shove, I think, is much less clear than what Kim Moon-soo would do. And I think that degree of uncertainty is unnerving at a time when South Korea needs very much, if not consensus, at least directional clarity in its foreign policy. And so that's something that I think is a point of concern.
Extremely interesting. I mean, especially to bring it full circle back to your comments at the top. On the one hand, pragmatism is a valuable commodity in an uncertain world. On the other, you've got the point about directional clarity in unifying the country. Extremely interesting, and that tension will be something we'll have to watch out for in the coming weeks and months. Maybe if I could just go back on one point, maybe more of a comment than a question. What's interesting here too to me about DPRK in Japan is that we often, I think, at least in the Korean election context, we put too much, I would say, too much emphasis on the South Korean piece and not enough in the United States piece, especially in the era of Donald Trump, in that in 2016, the U.S. took radically different positions on direction in terms of DPRK and trilateral relations between South Korea and Japan. The Trump administration very much broke with the Obama administration's policy directions in both cases, right? Direct negotiations and, frankly, a de-emphasis on the trilateral relationship. In 2024, they're in a completely different position. So I think watch that space, as a British boss of mine used to say. I think that's not an unimportant factor here. So great stuff there. Scott, let me give you the final word on this, and then we'll gavel down.
Well, I would just say that I agree about this values and transactional question, but President Trump himself seems to be emphasizing transactionalism over values in many of our interactions, including with North Korea and on the economic front. And so the really interesting question is, who is going to be best positioned to deal with that dimension of the way that the relationship is going to be managed under Trump?
And then I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, China positioning vis-a-vis there. Take us out on that question.
Well, I think that so far what we've heard from candidate Lee Jae-myung suggests a greater desire for balance. And I think the really interesting question is whether or not the U.S., and in particular U.S. policymakers, can accept the idea of a reversion to dual hedging by South Korea and greater balance between its emphasis on the U.S. and China respectively, compared to what President Yoon did, which was basically to embrace strategic alignment with the United States. And so I think that that is possibly a side effect of the choice, is that those issues are going to come into much greater scrutiny after the election.
All right, outstanding. Gavel is down on 113th episode of the CSIS Capital Cable. Dr. Professor Adam Hur, thank you so much for joining us. We will have to have you back. Insights Council was terrific, as expected, frankly, but it was outstanding. And really, I think we got into a lot of issues that we really haven't explored in detail here on the show, and that was largely attributed to you. So thank you for bringing all of your insights and outstanding analysis to the show. Scott, of course, Mr. Schneider, thanks again for your insights. As always, terrific as well. We are indebted to your counsel. We are indebted to your analysis, and thanks again for appearing here on short notice. And to Victor, thanks for not showing up again. We just got, what's going on with that book tour. And if you're marooned somewhere in Europe, send up the red star cluster. I'm happy to come to Portugal and spend a week on the beach looking for you. So there we go. All right, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. And Dusan is not out of the blocks well in KBO. Second to last, but hope springs eternal. Thanks, everybody. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I want to just